Hello and welcome to our online conference here at Addiction Hope. If you are sticking with us from the very beginning, thank you so much. We're so glad that you are here. This is our second CE event of the day. So what that means is this is a live event. We've got Dr. Gold right there. You can see him on the screen, and he's going to give an incredible presentation. There are CEs available, so you must be here throughout the entire presentation, listening to the presentation. And then at the end of Dr. Gold's session, I'm going to copy and paste a link into the chat section right there for all attendees. So you can click that link. It goes to a Google form that you will be able to fill out so that we can get the confirmation that you were here, you attended, we get your feedback, and we could submit that to issue your CEs. So super important if these CEs are important to you and that's why you're here. Make sure that you stay all the way till the end for the Google form link and submit that to us following the presentation. So that is the rundown on that. Now let me introduce you to our next conference presenter, Dr. Mark Gold. So Dr. Gold, he serves as chairman of the Addiction and Psychiatric Scientific Advisory Board, and also as the chairman of the Eating Disorders and Obesity Scientific Advisory Board. He served as professor, the Donald Disney Eminent Scholar, distinguished professor, and chair of psychiatry from 1990 to 2014. Dr. Gold was the first faculty from the College of Medicine to be selected as a university-wide distinguished alumni professor and served as the 17th University of Florida's distinguished alumni professor. He has many more years, decades, and honors besides just those, but he is clearly a wonder and a very well-respected man in the field. So, so welcome, Dr. Gold, and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, Kirsten, thank you very much. It's fun to be here, and I liked watching Brian's presentation. And of course, I've known Pat Carnes for a good majority of his career, and I always enjoy listening to him. And I'm grateful that he cited in his talk our dopamine deficiency hypothesis and paper in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs. I'll spend some time talking about that, but most of the talk that Kirsten and Jackie asked me to do was on behavioral addictions, food and sugar, and to keep a focus on that. But, you know, as you know, you can't have had a career in addiction medicine and been considered a pioneer and win a Lifetime Achievement Award without, oh, there you go. Let's see if that will move my slides. Without being able to talk a little bit about addictions. So really, we're in the middle of an opioid crisis. I put this up just because you can see that we're spiking with opioid deaths, clearly not from methadone, but from heroin and synthetic opioids. While that's been a major focus and related to these deaths of despair that everyone's focused on, at a very recent meeting, like 2 days ago, conference at the DEA headquarters in Washington, D.C., the data was presented by Bruce Goldberger and others on the causes of death and what we see when you look in post-mortem samples as far as deaths are concerned. And while opioids have received the predominant share of attention and focus, it's also true that the deaths are really from polysubstance abuse. Most of the deaths have multiple drugs. Many of the deaths when there's analysis have 3 or more drugs. And so death rates have gone up as synthetic opioids have entered the marketplace, but there still are polysubstance deaths. The most recent overdose to receive attention was Demi Lovato's. And we wrote a blog for Addiction Hope on this, in part because opioid overdoses are so common. we see them everywhere. And in her case, she was fortunate enough to, one, have people to call 911, and two, have someone to administer Narcan or naloxone. We've been promoting naloxone availability and training, looking at it somewhat similarly to how we look at CPR. Almost everyone has been trained in CPR. Most everyone can do a Heimlich maneuver and CPR if somebody chokes or has an apparent heart attack. But without naloxone, you can't rescue someone who's had an overdose. The signs of an overdose aren't asking a person what drug they took, because oftentimes they'll think that they've taken cocaine or another drug, and lo and behold, there's fentanyl or other synthetic opioids in it. They have an overdose. So it's really unresponsiveness, awake, but really can't talk, limp, pale, clammy, sweaty, blue fingernails from lack of circulation, reduced pulse. If you had blood pressure, you'd know their blood pressure was reduced. The skin might turn and change colors, and they'd make a gurgling sound. Once Narcan is given, the person will wake up. And now we have a nasal spray so that you don't have to be trained in giving an injection or finding a vein. You can clearly just give Narcan. There's no way to overdose on Narcan. And even if the person didn't have an opioid overdose, let's say, God forbid, they had a stroke, there'd be no harm in this, or if they had overdosed on something else. So we'd like to remember the man who invented naloxone and also naltrexone, Jacob Fishman, who really created this wonder drug, and we'd like to get it out there because, as you can see, heroin is the #1 cause of overdose death, and Narcan could help with that. Cocaine, over half of the cocaine deaths are probably due to synthetic opioids and oxycodone. So most of these deaths could be reversed. Some, especially during the prescription opioid crisis, many of the overdoses were not accidental, and that just underlines the importance of treating it like you would a CPR event. If someone has been rescued with CPR, we always send them to a doctor for an evaluation, comprehensive evaluation, to find out why it is that their heart stopped or why it is they had an irregular heartbeat. And they get evaluated, and treatment plan is developed. In the case of an opioid overdose, we want to be sure that they don't have a comorbid problem like depression or a comorbid physical problem like HIV, AIDS. We'd like to know that all of their medical and psychiatric problems will be treated at the same time. We'd like them to quickly enter into addiction treatment as well. So the CDC, this is just a slide to show what they recommend, and they'll say after, call 911, give Narcan, but you need to have it to be able to give it. And there are tragedies all the time in our population, and it's important to remember that it's not just the drug problem, it's often the trauma, concurrent infectious disease, heart disease, changes in the brain due to drugs or other changes, and persistent depression. And this is a depression for a good reason, because drugs, by targeting the brain's reinforcement areas over time, change them and can undermine them, as you saw in Pat Carnes' PET imaging and other imaging. And in doing that, changes the experience that the person has with the outside world and with pleasurable activities, so that even species survival behaviors, food, water, sex, become less reinforcing, as drugs of abuse are quicker and easier than all that work. Much of my career has been working on MATs and developing MATs, new treatments for cocaine and for opioid addicts. And, because I'm a basic scientist, really. My last invention is in the field of overeating and obesity, and that'll be the principal portion of the talk. But, as people know, we published the dopamine hypothesis in '84, and it's been the predominant hypothesis for how pleasure and drug addiction might occur and might also explain anhedonia and depression. Our work led to an understanding of where opioids, that's my #2 most popular paper, worked in the brain and how you might reverse that. My problem #3 was the first demonstration of behavioral addiction, in this case, problematic internet use. And then 5 was on food. So you can see that even though these are more current projects of mine, the number of times they're liked or cited by other people in the field is increasing, and increasing so much that the word's getting out that these are really important. These are what they call citation classics, and we'll come back to dopamine again. But the moral of the story was, if cocaine could cause these changes, and these changes were synonymous with self-administration, post-drug anhedonia, misery, and craving, and continued cocaine use, cocaine could be addicting without having a major abstinence or withdrawal syndrome. If that's the case, which it was, then cocaine should be reclassified, we claimed in '84, '85, and it was by '88 as a dangerous and addicting drug. And therefore, in addition, behaviors could be addicting, or other things which access the brain's reinforcement system, cause paying attention, craving, and wanting, and change the brain in a way consistent with cocaine, but without major abstinence syndrome. So you didn't have to have alcohol-related withdrawal or opioid-related withdrawal signs or symptoms to be addicting anymore. You could be gambling. You could be cocaine. All of the drugs of abuse cause D2 downregulation. We predicted that in '84. It was demonstrated here by Nora Volkov's group at Brookhaven. But the important part is that these downregulations occur quickly and occur most dramatically in cocaine, methamphetamine, and opioids, and similarly, but significantly, in alcohol and food. The recovery side is a big unknown. Like, is the brain fully recovered, you might ask, from these D2 dopamine changes from in proven cocaine abstinence 6 months later? And really, the answer is no. Treatment and recovery have to work to maintain abstinence and allow exercise, diet, wellness, other treatment attributes to kick in and be successful. Our group studied cocaine, and we learned a lot that's relevant to food, relevant to sexual compulsivity, relevant to internet messaging because of the dopamine effect. But it's hard to imagine this, but our group in the '80s had the first report of cocaine addiction, first report of cocaine-inducing lifelong panic, first report of crack being used, first report of cocaine being used for appetite suppression, especially in modeling and other professions where thinness was highly valued, cocaine causing movement disorders, cocaine addiction in doctors. While it's not among the favorites in likes or citations, like the cocaine dopamine hypothesis or the noradrenergic hypothesis for opioid addiction or the invention of clonidine, we are really proud of the 5-year outcome study showing that physicians in different health care programs in different states, but who get the same physician health program treatment, followed and studied for 5 years, showed 80% positive outcome with negative urines, positive return to work and functionality. And I think this is an excellent paper to evaluate treatment and to think about treatment efficacy more like oncology with 5-year outcomes and less like 3-month or even 1-month outcomes. We worked in food, and one of the projects we did was to show that when caffeine is even present in decaffeinated coffee, the relevance of this is that caffeine could be added to beverages, and it is, to sport drinks and others, to put a drug in there that would help you sell it, and the caffeine stimulates its own taking. Similarly, sugar could be added to these, and they are as well. That's just me as a young man in '83. So having a long career in the field, my first publications in 1972, I remember the cocaine era starting and the changes in body mass, so that you basically had very thin and very heavy stars, and a lot of tragedy. So there were 8 premature deaths in Saturday Night Live. All of them cut short brilliant careers, but gave people in the proximity and people who were watching a chance to see the interaction between sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and lead us again to rethink what addiction is on the basis of the experience in the 80s and on the basis of the cocaine epidemic. So what's an addiction? Could be gambling, could be food, could be internet, could be texting, could be the traditional drugs of abuse, as well as sex. And this is now summarized in an American Psychiatric Association textbook called Behavioral Addictions, which has chapters on all of these. And as Pat Carnes said, they're at various stages of approval for being considered addictions like anything else. So the DSM-5 was the first to include gambling, but of course gaming is in the international update. Our group showed that animals will press a lever for food. This is important because we define drugs of abuse, traditional drugs of abuse, on their ability to stimulate their own taking. So if you stick an animal in a chamber and put cocaine in an IV fluid, and it's getting an IV of cocaine, and compare that to giving it an IV worth of water, compare that to methamphetamine or heroin, you can show that drugs of abuse are self-administered, meaning use it once, use it again, and they basically will use it depending on what schedule you allow them. This led us to think that sugar was similar to other drugs of abuse, and we worked for many years. I worked with Bart Hubbell, Nicole Avena, and others at Princeton, and after Bart's death, continued the lab at Princeton for a number of years. He was really the pioneer here, comparing morphine self-administration to sugar self-administration, and Nicole Avena and I refined that work to develop a screening method, which is my latest patent, to look at what would happen if you added sugar to yogurt, to a sports drink. And if you model that in animals, you could use the self-administration of sugar as a model to develop new treatments, especially cutting down on sugar, ability to reinforce ongoing activity. So if you think about sugar self-administration like we think about alcohol self-administration, the treatment for for alcohol self-administration is either detoxin AA or it's harm reduction approach, which is medically assisted treatment using naltrexone. Naltrexone blocks alcohol's free access to brain reinforcement systems, so therefore people drink less. That it's not an abstinence approach. We moved this work to Yale, and Kelly Brownell and I, Kelly's the dean at the School of Public Health at Duke, brought together a panel of experts, and we put it all together in this textbook that's you can use to fall asleep. With Mark Potenza and Nora Volkow, we presented Food and Sugar, that's my work, Gambling, Potenza's work, and then the holistic, all the behaviors and dopamine imaging, Nora Volkow's work at a recent international ASAM meeting. And, you know, asking the question, what's more addictive? And if you ask this question, Oreos or cocaine, it's clearly cocaine, but people do feel a special attention and attraction to Oreos. And it's in the same system, but it's much more diminished. But it's important for us to think about in our research. So we thought about a number of ways. We could train animals to self-administer cocaine and feed them a steak, and self-administration rates go down if they'll eat the steak. That's very remarkable. And we could train animals to self-administer sugar and find what the relationship of that was to just other behaviors that a rat might perform, including exercise. This is summarized in the CASA, Columbia University booklet on food and addiction. It's free. You can download it just by Googling CASA food and food addiction. So what other lessons did we learn? We learned lessons from cigarettes. We learned that cigarette smoking.
Yes or no? Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive. Yes.
These are all the executives of the tobacco companies.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive. And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
So the question really is nicotine and cigarette smoking addictive? The answer is yes. What lessons can we learn from that relates to food? And that is a very interesting question, and I've studied this in animals and people. Obviously, smoking was promoted, especially to women, on this Virginia Slims or Keep a Slender Figure basis. Nicotine is a psychoactive ingredient, one of many that are released by combusting a cigarette and gets into the brain and changes the brain and body, causing mild antidepressant effects, mild anti-anxiety effects, and causing both of those, anxiety and depression, to happen in abstinence. But our work said, well, like weight gain or occurs after smoking cessation. That's a way that people are uncomfortable after they discontinue smoking, and they gain a lot of weight over a 12-month period, 5 kilograms. And that causes some people to relapse. We showed the same thing for amphetamine. It's been shown for most drugs of abuse, but cigarette smoking the #1 preventable cause of death globally, and weight gain is cited as a main cause of relapse. And so this has been studied, hoping that we'd find new treatments or find a new way of understanding what drives appetite. But to us, it's more than one driver. It's more than just dopamine, but cigarette smoking offers us a clue. Cigarette smoking itself is another example of a typical addiction, meaning detox isn't treatment. Mark Twain said that clearly. Stopping smoking is the easiest thing I've ever done. I've done it hundreds of times. So for alcohol or tobacco or other drugs, it's the same. For cannabis, we have a lot of experience because, again, I was a fellow and medical student during the height of the cannabis studies, and there's association between marijuana smoking and a drive to eat. Now, in marijuana addicts, when they stop or are given cannabinoid antagonists, we do find that they gain weight. But in the acute or irregular use, marijuana smoking causes a drive to eat. And this has now been studied by Yale researchers to look at how it is that this happens, where in the brain this happens. And so you have the Yale study saying that the two effects together of smoking cannabis give you a runaway hunger. Even if you just had dinner, all of a sudden the neurons tell you that you're hungry. This has been utilized, this effect, by entrepreneurial cookie salespeople selling Girl Scout cookies, where it was just covered on TV in San Diego that they're setting up their cookie stands outside of marijuana dispensaries. Again, so there's going to be a lesson in the tobacco addiction and withdrawal, and there's going to be a lesson in the cannabis effect. And maybe they're related because cannabis and tobacco have more in common than you think. Some of the tobacco-induced changes in the brain are to change the brain's own cannabinoid systems. So the 60s, what did I learn then? Well, I learned that if you had sex, drugs, and rock and roll in Woodstock, you didn't really think very much about food. And that was kind of Woodstock. And you can see the before and after the rains effect. Before there's food tense, and after there's not much of anything. And so that was a lesson. I learned a lot by detoxing opioid addicts. And what we did was we detoxed them from opioids using clonidine or lofexidine and put them on naltrexone. All these are common MATs, but the main finding was that they gained weight. So if they were opioid abstinents, they had a rebound hyperphagia and gained weight. I learned something in the snowstorm of the century, 1978. So I was running the Yale Medically Assisted Treatment Program, the methadone program, and at that time, in 78, the snow was so bad, we had 300 people, I think, on methadone at that time as a maintenance, and we wanted to be sure they had their doses. And so I had to try to get to the clinic, which I did. There was no electricity, there were no cell phones, but a nurse and I could be there to dispense the methadone if clients made it to the clinic. And they did have a hard time doing that. The state troopers did manage to get me there, and you can see it was not that easy to get around. That was the Connecticut Turnpike. I don't even think they had snowmobiles or anything that could get through. But you know, the trucks did start to work, and you know, people were stranded. I wasn't stranded, but I was able to get through these kind of winding pathways that we dug out. And over time, over the 3 days, people did come into the clinic. Very few people came in the first day. Very few people came in the second day. But we did see a lot of people then who came in who had withdrawal. And so heroin withdrawal and methadone withdrawal looks like the person's physically uncomfortable, they have nausea and vomiting, but they'll tell you that they can take the early stages of withdrawal and cause it to go away by eating sugar, by putting sugar in a spoon, pretending that they're going to inject it, heat it up, pretending that it's heroin, drawing it up in a syringe, pretending they'll inject themselves, skin popping themselves, and doing everything that was in their drug ritual. And this could remove the withdrawal. It would always come back, but remove it. And then when they were really desperate, they just became drunk. So they would drink and drink and drink. And that was another lesson. I remembered that revolutionary and Civil War analgesia, even for amputations, was carried out with, whiskey and alcohol. So again, the commonality between alcohol and drugs of abuse, alcohol and opioid systems. And that all reminded me of this classic study by Gene Redmond's group, taking the green vervet monkeys of St. Kitts and looking at them in the wild. And what they show is the missing link between sugarcane, which is fermented and becomes alcohol in the wild, and soft drinks, and how the animals behave.
This is the sleepy island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. "300 years ago, vervet monkeys were brought here from West Africa along with slaves serving the rum industry. Escaped monkeys acquired a taste for alcohol by eating fermented sugarcane left in the fields. Today, they satisfy their thirst by raiding local bars. They have learned to be sneaky. Picking the right moment is everything. For years, the monkeys have been studied for insights into our own drinking habits. Just as we vary in our taste for alcohol, so do the monkeys. Some do anything for an alcoholic cocktail. But just as some people are teetotal, so are some monkeys. These reject alcohol in favor of soft drink. Significantly, the percentage of teetotal monkeys matches the non-drinkers in the human population. In line with human habits, most drink in moderation. 12% are steady drinkers, and 5% drink to the last drop. This similarity between us shows that a liking for alcohol is determined mainly by our genes. After each daily raid, other human parallels soon appear. But unlike us, monkeys that are heavy drinkers make better leaders, respected by other monkeys. They seem to tolerate leaders that monkey around. Like monkeys, our taste for alcohol began when we scoured the forest for ripe fermenting fruit.
Bristol Myers was 605.
Food and alcohol became linked with intoxicating effect.
Thanks. So what you can see is that in the wild, sugarcane, alias sugar, ferments, turns to alcohol, and that's the link between sugar and sugar self-administration and many foods and many food compulsivities and addictions, because they share so much common feature. This is particularly the case for a mentor of mine who became the inventor of Gatorade. He had a sports drink and a drink that he could use as an oral replacement for diarrheal and rehydration of usefulness in Africa, in some of the diarrhea dehydration cases, and at the University of Florida, where the football team has to play in 100-degree temperature. But his first, I think it was 2 full versions of the drink, didn't catch on beyond that because they just didn't taste good. And in addition, that taste could make it reinforcing. And so by adding so much sugar to Gatorade, I think he was able to accomplish that. There's also, think about AA and NA meetings where there are local traditions with sugar cookies and baking, and many of the traditions revolve around don't be too hungry, don't be too angry, don't be too lonely, don't be too tired, and all the protections against relapse. But it starts with hunger. And in the old days, we used to take people who were detoxing from heroin and give them sugar cubes and even packs of sugar, to hard candies to carry around with them when they felt craving. So while this work was really exciting for me and Bart Hubbell and our students, no one ever referenced it. And in research, you only can tell if a paper is important by the number of citations or the number of times it's referenced. No one really referenced it for 20 years. And I have a review of my 30 years work, and still I don't think anybody for the first 30 years really paid much attention to it, until the Yale Historic Conference, where Kelly Brownell and I brought the experts from around the world, some that worked in overeating and liver disease, some that worked in overeating and bariatric surgery, some that worked in overeating and medically assisted treatments, some that worked in psychology and psychological approaches and group approaches. We brought them all together, and Nora gave the keynote, and it helped focus the field on this. In foods, sugar could be added to a food, like it is to yogurt, it is to other drinks, and thereby become the drug of abuse that allows you to have a chemical stimulation of its own taking. So if you think about cigarettes, and back to the analogy with the companies saying it's not addicting, cigarette smoking is to nicotine, the psychoactive ingredient that makes cigarette smoking so addicting, as food is to sugar, with sugar being a key component. So we look at this, you eat something with sugar in it, you crave it, it has addictive properties, blood levels spike, dopamine's released, the brain says do it again, blood sugar levels fall, you have more craving, you have searching for sugar, and this cycle is repeated again and again. And this is part of the reason that we have a global obesity or globesity crisis. And to look at what Pat said, just all of the tobacco-related savings in healthcare spending have now been replaced by obesity. So again, animals will self-administer sugar. The glucose is self-administered. Fructose corn syrup is self-administered. And we could use this model to develop new pharmacological therapies. The main difference between glucose and fructose was that not that one is self-administered more or less, dopamine is released after both, is that the sugar animals tend to be thinner than the fructose corn syrup animals. So if you just look at soft drinks and say cigarettes are to nicotine as soft drinks are to sugar, look at all of the sugar in these drinks. No person would eat this many sugar cubes, but clearly they do get the same net effect on the brain by drinking these drinks. And there are even self-administration of cocaine, just like it was cocaine, but it's sugar. So this was the message in the New York City anti-obesity commercial. Pretty gross. You can, and that's the target's the brain, whether it's sugar or cocaine. Cocaine is clearly much more addicting, but the targeting is very specific. Sugar's been added to everything. You have to look at labels. It's in fruit drink, fruit juice, and there's so many different forms that it's very hard to keep up with. But just caution that this is how fruit drinks become reinforcing. Nicole Lavina's work after Princeton was to go on, and this is a really good summary. She's a great student of Bart Hubbell's and mine. This is a wonderful summary in her TED Talk of the whole sugar connection. Well, that's interesting. Let's see if I get that to work. If not.
Picture warm, gooey cookies, crunchy candies, velvety cakes, waffle cones piled high with ice cream. Is your mouth watering? Are you craving dessert? Why? What happens in the brain that makes sugary foods so hard to resist? Sugar is a general term used to describe a class of molecules called carbohydrates, and it's found in a wide variety of food and drink. Just check the labels on sweet products you buy. Glucose, fructose, sucrose, maltose, lactose, dextrose, and starch are all forms of sugar. So are high fructose corn syrup, fruit juice, raw sugar, and honey. And sugar isn't just in candies and desserts. It's also added to tomato sauce, yogurt, dried fruit, flavored waters, or granola bars. Since sugar is everywhere, it's important to understand how it affects the brain. What happens when sugar hits your tongue? And does eating a little bit of sugar make you crave more? You take a bite of cereal. The sugars it contains activate the sweet taste receptors, part of the taste buds on the tongue. These receptors send a signal up to the brainstem, and from there it forks off into many areas of the forebrain, one of which is the cerebral cortex. Different sections of the cerebral cortex process different tastes: bitter, salty, umami, and in our case, sweet. From here, the signal activates the brain's reward system. This reward system is a series of electrical and chemical pathways across several different regions of the brain. It's a complicated network, but it helps answer a single subconscious question. Should I do that again? That warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you taste grandma's chocolate cake? That's your reward system saying, yes. And it's not just activated by food. Socializing, sexual behavior, and drugs are just a few examples of things and experiences that also activate the reward system. But overactivating this reward system kickstarts a series of unfortunate events: loss of control, craving, and increased tolerance to sugar. Let's get back to our bite of cereal. It travels down into your stomach and eventually into your gut. And guess what? There are sugar receptors here too. They're not taste buds, but they do send signals telling your brain that you're full, or that your body should produce more insulin to deal with the extra sugar you're eating. The major currency of our reward system is dopamine, an important chemical or neurotransmitter. There are many dopamine receptors in the forebrain, but they're not evenly distributed. Certain areas contain dense clusters of receptors, and these dopamine hotspots are a part of our reward system. Drugs like alcohol, nicotine, or heroin send dopamine into overdrive, leading some people to constantly seek that high. In other words, to be addicted. Sugar also causes dopamine to be released, though not as violently as drugs. And sugar is rare among dopamine-inducing foods. Broccoli, for example, has no effect, which probably explains why it's so hard to get kids to eat their veggies. Speaking of healthy foods, let's say you're hungry and decide to eat a balanced meal. You do, and dopamine levels spike in the reward system hotspots. But if you eat that same dish many days in a row, dopamine levels will spike less and less, eventually leveling out. That's because when it comes to food, the brain evolved to pay special attention to new or different tastes. Why? 2 reasons. First, to detect food that's gone bad. And second, because the more variety we have in our diet, the more likely we are to get all the nutrients we need. To keep that variety up, we need to be able to recognize a new food, and more importantly, we need to want to keep eating new foods. And that's why the dopamine levels off when a food becomes boring. Now back to that meal. What happens if in place of the healthy, balanced dish, you eat sugar-rich food instead? If you rarely eat sugar, or don't eat much at a time, the effect is similar to that of the balanced meal. But if you eat too much, the dopamine response does not level out. In other words, eating lots of sugar will continue to feel rewarding. In this way, sugar behaves a little bit like a drug. It's one reason people seem to be hooked on sugary foods. So think back to all those different kinds of sugar. Each one is unique, but every time any sugar is consumed, it kickstarts a domino effect in the brain that sparks a rewarding feeling. Too much too often, and things can go into overdrive. So yes, overconsumption of sugar can have addictive effects on the brain, but a wedge of cake once in a while won't hurt you.
So this has been really interesting, the response. So many of the food makers have been upset about this, and we don't mean for anyone to be upset. It's just important for the consumer, especially the consumer that's having some food compulsivity or weight issues, to know how much sugar is in their diet and how much fructose corn syrup and so on, and to understand these interactions. It's also important that for people who are developing new treatments, because clearly eliminating appetite, which is the essence of a survival behavior, is going to be quite different than reducing food reinforcement. We should be able to do the latter a lot easier than the former. Other things that could be done on prevention, this was Kelly Brownell's idea, which is to restrict the amount of exposure to fast food, both in utero and in early life. And for us to understand what's in foods that we eat. Now I do this one quickly, but this is a Chicken McNuggets and chicken nuggets. Well, you can find that online. The other kind of key work, and again, from Kelly Brownell's group, both Kelly and I helped Ashley get going, but she's now doing great food science at the University of Michigan, where she's working on trigger foods and food preference. And so she's developed the Yale Food Addiction Test. This is available online. You can Google it. It's available in other languages. It's been correlated with functional imaging changes. And just like we have binge eating disorder evaluation for the DSM-5 diagnosis, you can get a Yale Food Addiction, yes or no, answer from the scales. Which foods are the most addicting and which are the greatest trigger foods? These are both Ashley and Nicole Avina's work. Chocolate, ice cream, French fries, pizza, cookies is not a big surprise. These are the foods that you would probably think of when you think of foods like that. But way down in the bottom are broccoli. So, you know, if you could add sugar to broccoli, you'd turn this table upside down. So we think food can be addictive, and we do think food addiction is an emerging diagnostic category, and especially sugar being a key element of the addiction process to food, as well as a target for public health initiatives. Other kinds of eating disorders, we have the binge eating disorder. That's, again, very interesting from an addiction point of view because it's treated as if it's a ADHD or psychostimulant treatment. But there's a good and easy diagnostic scheme available now. And Nicole has looked at eating as a modern pleasure, so that food is more than food. It's not subsistence. It's the search for foods to cause pleasure. This is relevant to the problem of body mass index, because if you want to maximize the brain reinforcement produced by food, you would have a different type of food every day. Right? Today you'll have Mexican food, and tomorrow you might have steak, and the next day you might have Italian. The more diversity, the more brain reinforcement, and the more you'll eat. Whereas if you ate the same food, even if it was a highly energy dense food or high sugar food, it was the exact same meal every day, you'd eat less and less and less over time because it becomes boring. And that's a good and useful piece of information if you're trying to manage your food. For gambling and gaming, there have been approaches to treat these with opioid antagonists. So you do almost get the situation where sugar is probably addicting on the basis of dopamine release and brain opioid, naturally occurring opioid effects, and quite the same for gambling, internet, and gaming, where naltrexone is being used and nalmefene is being used. Dopamine is the key molecule. You heard that from Pat. It's in our old textbook as well as in our papers in the 80s. But the dopamine codes the learning, makes the human being pay attention, and does this in a way that makes treatment very difficult because it's a pathological attachment. Meta-analysis show behavioral treatments have efficacy in internet gaming, especially CBT, for reducing time spent online and reprioritizing social engagements and non-online engagement. There's a comorbidity, just like for addiction, we talk about comorbidities with depression and anxiety disorders. And for behavioral addictions, there are personality traits, OCPD, like the personality of an obsessive compulsive, as well as having obsessive compulsive disorder. But the neural systems of focus are the dopamine systems whether for gambling or substance or other behavioral addictions, and they're the so-called mesolimbic reward system. I'll end with secondhand effects. An unknown, I have a couple more minutes, just people have not paid very much attention to in utero effects, early developmental childhood effects, and have focused mistakenly on genes at conception. Genes at conception are a very small part. Genes are always changing. They're epigenetic. They're changing in response to environmental exposure. Children of cigarette-smoking mothers are born with more nicotine receptors than they would have on the basis of conception. Obese pregnant rats, overfed sugar, produce offspring that are sugar-seeking. And by the way, they're also alcohol-preferring. So, and our group showed that children in Afghanistan exposed to secondhand smoke of opium had opium in their own bodies and had developmental and other lags, as well as receptor changes. So exposure is very important. And I do think we should keep track of, we want clean air that's tobacco-free and also other drug-free, whether it's crack, opium, or cannabis, as this Jimmy Kimmel demonstrated.
Carelessness and cannabis triggered a house fire in San Diego when firefighters put out.
Whoops, sorry. See if that helps.
Carelessness and cannabis triggered a house fire in San Diego when firefighters put out the flames. They discovered an elaborate pot growing operation there in the garage. Firefighters say some of those marijuana plants did burn, but they also say one person was treated for smoke inhalation.
I inhaled so much smoke.
We've also shown that in animal studies that secondhand smoke is firsthand smoke for the non-smoker causes changes in the brain, euphoria, receptor changes, and drive for eating. And that's in part due to the changes in cannabis, THC, access liberated by smoking. So in summary, we have a polydrug using country with drugs targeting the brain and reinforcement systems. We have events like Pat Carnes described in pornography and sexual compulsivity that target the same system, lotteries, gambling that targets the same system, sugar-like compounds that target the same system. And so we have a primitive brain system that typically was reserved to reinforce just the most specific and important species survival drives now being accessed by TV, the media, internet, and everything else, as well as drugs of abuse. And this really means that we are likely to have more of this polysubstance abuse and more of the consequences that Pat described that are bankrupting the healthcare system and causing so much distress for so many people in the United States. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Gold. We really appreciate you. Thank you so much for a great presentation.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.